Between the 16th and 19th centuries, an estimated 30 million Africans were violently taken from their homes and sold as slaves in Europe and the Americas. Today, their descendants continue to suffer from systemic racism in nearly every aspect of daily life. That's according to a new report by the UN, which also says governments continue to deny slavery's terrible and lasting legacy. Paolo Montecillo has more.
George Floyd's family lost a son, brother, and father last year. So they asked for the harshest penalty possible for his murderer, the former police officer Derek Chauvin.
My niece Gianna, she needs closure. I'm asking that you please find it suitable to give Officer Chauvin the maximum sentence possible, charge that he has been found guilty for. My family and I have been given a life sentence. We will never be able to get George back.
On Friday, a court sentenced Chauvin to prison for 22 and a half years, short of the maximum 30 allowed under the law. The punishment may be a disappointment for the family, but the impact of Floyd's death goes beyond the streets of Minneapolis where he was killed. The UN is calling for a global, coordinated effort to combat racism against people of African descent.
The status quo is untenable. Systemic racism needs a systemic response. We need a transformative approach that tackles the interconnected areas that drive racism and lead to repeated, wholly avoidable tragedies like the death of George Floyd.
The UN says Black people are more likely to be poor, unemployed, undereducated, and over-policed in the US, Europe, and Latin America. It's those same places where Africans were enslaved based on the color of their skin. And the UN says many former slaveholding countries have failed to acknowledge the enduring harm they've caused.
The call to step up demands that we stop denying and start dismantling systemic racism, recognizing that any hope of success depends on comprehensive, not piecemeal approaches to alter structures, institutions, and behaviors that contribute to discrimination against Africans and people of African descent in every part of life.
It calls for increased government investment in education, employment, healthcare, and housing to uplift Black communities, and for more transparency and better training for law enforcement. The UN says governments should also look for ways to resolve conflicts that don't require the use of violence, which is too often proven deadly. Paolo Montecillo, TRT World.
Now, for more on the findings and recommendations from this report, let's go to Mona Rishmawi. She runs the Rule of Law and Equality branch at the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and joins us now from Geneva. Welcome to the show. Now, I want to quote part of this report where the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights says all states must stop denying and start dismantling racism. That's saying entire governments are willfully ignoring the harm they've caused to millions of people. It's quite a damning sort of assessment, isn't it?
Well, we looked at the situation in about 60 countries. So the report really covers a wide range of countries. And we found that people believe they have this misconception because slavery ended, all the problems that are associated with it ended. But actually, that's not true. And in our parts of the world, and I am from the Middle East, we also have our own legacies in this regard. So when slavery ended, the problem is that they left a legacy, and the legacy is still there. And this legacy is the daily reality of the people of African descent in many countries. So what we are saying is that when there are problems like this, which are so deep and so profound, what is needed is that there is a whole government approach to look deep at the root of the problem and to find solutions. And we come here with, in this report, we propose a 4-tier agenda where basically says, stop the denial, look at it from a much more proactive point of view, look at the action of law enforcement and transform what the law enforcement is doing, look at the legacy of slavery and the slave trade and repair that legacy. And basically, and the very important point is that the voices and the people who stand up against racism their demands must be heard and their voices must be heard and acted on.
Now, I'll come to the points about recommendations in the report, but first I want to talk about one of the focus areas that you talked about was police brutality and violence. Tell us, what is in your assessment, is the impact beyond the victims and their families on entire communities when these kind of incidents take place?
Well, the basic point is very simple. The basic point is that the police is there, or law enforcement is there to uphold the law and be at the service of the communities. So it's very important that there is a trust, there is a collaboration and cooperation. And the more the police in all societies, the more the police uses heavy hand, or law enforcement uses the heavy hand, the trust is actually broken. So what we found that in a number of situations that we looked at very specific cases in a number of specific contexts, particularly in a context of like coming at for small minor crimes or stops and searches, or in very sad situations where they come as a first respondent to mental health issues. The families call the police because there is a mental health crisis, or in the case of war on drug or gangs, or similar police operations. In these big police operations, unfortunately, excessive force is used, and people end up, particularly people of African descent in this context, end up dead at the police hand. So there is something to be reckoned with. There is a story here. There are patterns here that needs to be actually addressed.
Okay, Mona, when we talk about reparations that are mentioned in this report, what specifically are we talking about? Are we talking about job quotas for minorities, cash handouts? Exactly how would states go about doing this?
Well, there is a whole host of measures that can be taken and are taken, starting with knowing the truth of actually what happened during these eras, what happened during these situations that we are talking about, and allowing people to mark their history, to memorize it, to actually know what happened, where they came from, and what happened to their families. What we found is that there is very good initiatives in this regard. There are museums, there are memorials, there are actually areas which are marked. But a lot of it is done by the communities themselves, by the Afro-descendant communities themselves. So I think memorization and knowing the truth about what is going on and what happened actually is extremely important. The second area is really justice and accountability. What we found is that in very few of the cases that we looked into, and George Floyd in this case becomes the exception rather than the rule, is that the death at the hands of police is really rarely investigated. There is an association, and a very negative association and worrying association, of people of African descent with criminality and with and in general blackness and the people of color with criminality, and that's really, really worrying. So that has to change. And the last part that I would like to mention is the issue of actual reparation, compensation, if you want. The compensation here has to be at the individualized basis, and of course at the community basis. There are developments that needs at the collective basis. There are development projects and development work that needs to be done, because we found that in a number of countries, actually, not one or two, actually quite a few in a number of countries.
Right, so a lot that needs to be done, but perhaps the first step has to be acknowledging the truth. Mona Rishmawi, thank you so much for joining us from the UNHCR.
Thank you for having me.